My name is Rich Schmidt. We're here with Evan Rose. It's July 9th, 2024, and we're at Stoller in Dayton. Evan, thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, absolutely. Glad to be here.
First question is, why wine?
Well, my story in wine started in Ohio close to 20 years ago, and really getting off into it was just a summer job. Nothing that I really had a interest in ahead of time. A small winery opened up in my neighborhood, basically, and was looking for help. I was 14, turned 15 that summer. Pulled a lot of weeds, kind of did some minimal things in the vineyard, but not a whole lot of stuff that I had any idea what I was doing, or, all pretty safe stuff, pretty pretty minimal stuff, things that a couple of teenagers could take care of. There is a small industry in Ohio. Along the Ohio River is where I grew up, just east of Cincinnati. There's a bit of vineyards there. The early 2000s kind of had a bit of a surge in kind of some small producers growing their own vines and making wine, and different levels of hybrids and vinifera, some fruit wines, all kinds of things. And then there's a bit larger industry up along Lake Erie in Ohio. So there's kind of two, the bottom and the top of the state kind of have their own industries. One of the guys that I started, or the gentleman that I started working for, his name's Bill Scarvarla, and he got into it. Why wine for him, I think, was a bit of a home winemaker, and then in one of the small circles in Cincinnati got in connection with a guy named Ron Barrett. And Ron Barrett had worked out in Oregon in the 80s and 90s. He worked quite a bit with Dick Erath, I think with a few others, worked in conjunction with Knudsen Vineyard, and that's kind of where he really got his start in wine. He'd come from an engineering background. And then I think some of his, I think his mother got sick. He was originally from Ohio, and so he came back and wanted to continue into wine, and searched around for a parcel of land that was appropriate to grow grapes. Found a patch of limestone along the Ohio River, and he started about a 5-acre vineyard of all vinifera there in Ohio. And then he kind of was responsible for getting 3 or 4 other people into the industry as it goes, Only takes one bad apple, but for sure.
The top of the Ponzi scheme.
Yeah. And so, he got the guy that I originally started working for, Bill Scarvarla, into wine, and he was just looking for help one summer, and that's how I kind of stumbled in the door, stumbled across the street pretty much, that close to my home that I grew up in. And I ended up working for him every summer throughout high school and college, and a little bit after college as well, a little moonlighting. But really strong relationship there. I worked for Ron Barrett as well down. So the 2 wineries, I guess I should mention those. So Bill Scarvarla's winery was Harmony Hill, still is. And the other one for Ron Barrett was Kincaid Ridge, which is no longer, he's retired now and kind of off into the next chapter of his life. So a lot of really good, kind of interesting influences there in the beginning. But
Tell me about, was there a point in there when you thought this would be something you would want to keep doing, or was it just a summer gig?
Yeah, I think, certainly that first summer, like I said, I think I turned 15 that summer, and I think I thought it was cooler than a lot of the other. Everybody was kind of getting their first job, and a lot of grocery store, that kind of thing, and thought it was a better job. The summers aren't always pleasant in Ohio. Lots of nice humidity and some heat for sure. And so, being outside, it was kind of countered by the just the kind of enjoyment of working with the plants. And probably it wasn't until the end of the summer that I really kind of got into maybe a little more involvement full on with the vines, and a little more instruction of this is what we're doing, this is what we're after. I think by that point, I'd maybe showed a little interest, and then over the winter, back to school, and maybe occasionally there was a little bit. It was a full-on farm beyond the grapevines, so there were some other things that I also initially did in the beginning, and then back to the next spring. I think that second summer, which would have been my, I think, junior year in high school. I really got much more interested in it. They were a young brand, so their first commercial wine was 2003. I started started the summer of 2003, and then in 2004, 2005, it's kind of the first time they started selling wine to the public, and so also got to see a little bit of that. I'd kind of run cases around in the back, the things you can legally do at 15. Just kind of got to be around like some of the, enjoyment, enthusiasm around wine in general. It was kind of what I would call a very old school tasting room. My first vintage in Oregon, which we'll come around to, was 2011. And tasting rooms were very much just like you just kind of tasted the wine and usually went about your way. And that's very much what this was like. So people really, a lot of education around the wine. Ohio, it's a mixed bag as far as, how much people are, how much knowledge they have around wine, and certainly didn't have any knowledge around Ohio wine at that point in time. So that was really engaging. And that second summer, I think as I just showed more general interest and showed the fact that I was retaining some of the information that I was getting, the owner just worked more and more with me, and we kind of progressed. And into that next winter, actually started doing like a little bit of the winter pruning and some of the jobs that were a little more involved. And when I look back on a lot of it now, and even just a few years later, 4 or 5 years later, I look back on some of those early jobs where I would really stress out about pruning cuts and things like that, and I would realize looking back that the owner had me, Bill had me leave a lot more material on the vine and things. I wasn't making the ultimate cuts, which I felt like I was making at the time, and that I was going to ruin the plant for life kind of deal. And looking back, yeah, he certainly eased me into it, but still felt like a fair amount of responsibility. And I think after that. So after the second year, I started working at Kincaid Ridge as well. So split time between Harmony Hill and Kincaid Ridge, and just kind of getting experience from both sides. The Ohio Valley has an interesting history with wine. In the 1800s, it was actually the largest producer of wine in the United States. They had a kind of a 50-year sweet spot where they were producing a tremendous amount of wine, about 5,000 acres just outside of Cincinnati. A lot of German immigrants came to Cincinnati. The kind of one of the hip areas in Cincinnati is still called Over the Rhine. So Rhineland, a lot of they found a lot of connection to the Rhine River and the Ohio River, and they tried a lot of different grape varieties there in the 1800s. A lot of things didn't work because of the humidity, phylloxera, different things. And they eventually settled on a grape called Catawba, which is an American grape that they ended up making quite a bit of sparkling wine out of. There's one gentleman, Nicholas Longworth, that name you actually see all over Cincinnati today, and most people have no idea that this gentleman ever had any connection to wine. Don't hold me to this, but I believe he was actually a lawyer, and a lot of times he would take payment for his fees, like land or things like that. And so he kind of at some point had a fair amount of land, planted a lot of grapevines, started making a lot of wine. And it's pretty cool. If you look back, there are some menus from like New York where some of Nicholas Longworth's sparkling wine is more expensive than like Dom Perignon and things like that. Just kind of crazy. There's stories that it was imported to France at times. Don't hold me to any of those. I think the French very much say no. So kind of a crazy history. Eventually, a couple different things, some disease pressure, and then eventually prohibition kind of put the absolute kind of finishing touches on the Ohio wine industry at that scale. And then I really think, there were some folks in the 60s and 70s that started, and then a little bit more interest maybe in the later 80s, 90s. And then I feel like that period where I came up in the early to mid 2000s, there was really kind of another boom of a lot of really small producers that were growing their own grapes, and a lot of times really making some pretty interesting wines. Yeah, it was an interesting place to get started for sure.
So tell me about college. When you're heading to college, choosing a school, did wine have any part in it?
Absolutely. So by my senior year, I was really into it. I had all kinds of wine books. I had maps that I was drawing of the vineyard I worked at, and maps of like my grandfather was a corn and soybean farmer, and like looking at aerial maps of his land and things like that, and trying to figure out my future in the Ohio wine industry. And kind of got way off into it. Probably a little too concerning. My parents were super supportive. They were great. They would go around to different wineries with me, and I couldn't taste any wine at the wineries, but I'd kind of like smell things, and I'd actually make them like buy the wines that I felt like something was wrong with. To take it back to the winery I worked at and be like, what am I smelling here? And might have been tasting a little bit of wine, off the books. But so really got into it. 2006 was my going into my senior year of high school. Actually made a little bit of rosé that harvest. So the winemaker I worked for gave me some juice and took it home. And started making a little bit of wine that year. I still have one bottle left. It's not so rosé looking anymore, but not too bad of a color. I will say it doesn't look terrible. And so that year, when it kind of came time to looking at colleges, my experience in the wine industry had been that most of the people in the Ohio, Indiana, Kentucky area, because I had started to also go along occasionally to some wine conferences and things like that, so I'd meet some other folks from further out and from along Lake Erie, New York, Pennsylvania, things like that. Almost everybody, it was a second career for them. So they'd, not always been like, I hate to use the term made their money somewhere else, but because it wasn't always like they were a tremendously wealthy person or anything like that, but they had just got to a point in their life where they could make a change, they could start their own business. Maybe they had a farm already, things like that. And so I think at that point I still was really like, well, that's the only obvious way in, is that you got to go have a career somewhere else, and then eventually, get off into wine when you have the resources to do so. My mom worked for a dentist for most of her career, and he kind of got me interested in going down some sort of like a pre-med route. And so when I started looking for colleges, I was sort of looking for places that had really good science programs for sure, maybe some medical, but then I really also wanted to have some sort of interest in grapes as well. So I started looking. UC Davis and like Fresno State, programs like that, they really felt so far in that. I think also that connection to like, I felt like I had to do something else first, which now feels, silly. And so I didn't look too heavily at those programs. I looked a little bit at Cornell. Virginia Tech at the time had a really good program under Tony Wolf on the viticulture side of things. Purdue had a fairly strong food science program. And then Michigan State also had a fairly good viticulture program. So those, Purdue, Michigan State, and Virginia Tech sort of became my focus, and but I also applied to Ohio State and Miami University and Ohio University. I applied to my kind of good old Ohio schools, all very good agricultural schools and science schools. So Very good. I visited Virginia Tech, and one of the downsides for me when I got there was the viticulture program was at an extension place like a couple hours away. And so it was really one of those, and so you wouldn't get to those classes until your kind of final years there, and then you had to leave campus. And at that point in time, that seemed not so great. And Michigan State, we were like ready to visit, and I got an email back from, I'm actually forgetting his name right now, but the professor that ran their program was retiring, and they didn't know if they were maybe going to scrap that program altogether. And so Michigan State kind of fell by the side. And then Purdue, I still really I visited the program. It was, like I said, more of like a food science program that you could get a little wine action at the same time, and it stayed a strong option, and kind of came down to actually Purdue and Miami University in Ohio that are the two that I got the strongest scholarships from, and in Miami, I ended up just kind of going there. It just like it was a good feel at the time, and so didn't ultimately. I think I was too nervous. I think I was on that path of like I got to do something else first, and it felt like Miami was the better fit for me to do something else first. And so I went to Miami University in Ohio. Went in undeclared, potentially interested in like sort of a pre-med type path. At Miami, if you're going to go pre-med, you either study microbiology, zoology, or botany. At the time, now I believe they've all merged into biology, so it's kind of back into one program. So I went and just started taking kind of those entry-level science classes, and pretty quickly got, like, because of my connection with the vineyard, got very heavily interested in the botany program. For the pre-med, as you would, think, the zoology and microbiology were much more heavily favored for pre-med. There were a few people that were interested in like more like medicinal, plants and things like that. And so it was pretty small there. And so I declared my major in my freshman year. And then I also got in touch with a guy named Jack Keegan. Jack Keegan ran the greenhouses on Miami's campus. And he also taught a wines class. A lot of universities have like a wine appreciation class, something like that. I would say this is to that level and then beyond. Eventually, when I fully got involved with it, it's a pretty in-depth course. And I kind of introduced myself to Jack my freshman year, and then we sort of really didn't end up connecting too much. I was also I was painfully shy as a high schooler, and I was more comfortable like sitting in a room of a bunch of older people like talking about viticulture than I was sitting in a room with like my peers. So it was always a bit of an interesting experience. And so I think I was trying to balance that out, and I think he invited me to a few wines class things, and I did attend my freshman year, and then we kind of sort of until my junior year come back around, and in that interim, I think I had fully pretty much, I still kept the like maybe pre-med or some sort of other, going down the route of like a pharmaceutical, Eli Lilly, like kind of research, botany, that kind of level, going back and forth, but still kept, working at the vineyards during the summers. And then when Jack and I kind of reconnected junior year, I took the class, really got to know Jack very well. It's pretty hard to go to like any city, any kind of major wine thing and not run into somebody that somehow knows Jack Keegan. He was just actually out here for a visit, stayed with me for a few days, and we were tasting around the valley, and we pulled up to one event at the new winery Vinovate on the Dundee Hills, and somebody had a Miami University license plate, and I was like, you're probably gonna know him, and and he's like, no, like you should probably know him. And I was like, I probably won't. And like we walk into the room, and we were in there. There were like 50 people in the room, maybe 30 seconds, and Jack's like, oh hey Brandon, like how's it going? Like it's and so he's taught this wines class for 25 years since a little more than 25 years, and he actually took it over from a guy who had it in the geology program. When that gentleman moved on from Miami University, he moved it over to the botany program at the time, eventually biology, and kind of kept it going. And the course is the first 6 weeks are no wine tasting, and all kind of starts at the very beginning, the history, going back to the Georgians and Egyptians, and kind of starting at the very beginning. And then working your way on up through the history of wine, and then a couple weeks on viticulture, a couple weeks on enology. And then the final 6 weeks of the course are kind of a tour around, you start 1 week in California, Oregon, West Coast American, week in France, week in Spain, and tasting wines from those regions. And he's really got access to some really nice wines, and kind of gives everybody the gamut from the very affordable college student wines up to, we tasted Chateau Yquem, Sauternes, things that I still rarely get the opportunity to taste. So kind of gave people a huge intro to wine. I think now he's at around 7,000 students through the course, and it's amazing how many different people. There's a small amount of us that are making wine, a lot of people that are more on the sales or importing, and then just a tremendous amount of people that just have a interest and a passion in wine now because of that course. And so it's always really interesting to run back into that. So I would say certainly Bill Scavarla and Ron Barrett got me started in the wine industry, and then Jack Keegan really fanned the flames, and that's my first real big introduction to European wines. And I think that's when the idea of leaving the Ohio wine industry first really entered my mind, that I might go make my career somewhere else, which is pretty wild to think that it was a junior in college before that ever kind of really clicked in my head. A lot of these things seem silly thinking back now. And so I took the class, and then I TA'd it for both semesters of my senior year, and we just kind of got further and further off into the world of wine, and met a lot of other people that were super interested in wine, and kind of started shaping my plans for after that. I was thinking about going to grad school potentially for viticulture. I was still much more most of my experience was in the vineyard. I did over those years of college at Harmony Hill, specifically started working more and more in the winery. Definitely during harvest, I would try to get back. A little tricky with the college semesters, but would get back and work in the winery quite a bit more. So that the enology interest was picking up as well, but certainly much more interested in the vineyard. And so when I was trying to decide, I looked at a few grad schools. I actually visited Fresno State and San Luis Obispo. They didn't have a grad program at that time. I'm not sure if they do now. So that would have been kind of a second undergrad maybe option. I visited those schools with a couple of other botany professors. I did a little research in college on a wildflower, and we were collecting the wildflowers in California, and everybody by then pretty much knew that I was pretty off into wine, and so they're like, yeah, let's go visit schools and some wineries, and I still wasn't 21 at that point. And so, yeah, once again, kind of telling the other folks, I was like, yeah, buy that one, we'll taste that one later. Yeah, so, really great experiences there. And I was looking at Washington State, Oregon State, talking to a whole bunch of people, and I was sort of landed on Washington State a bit, and the professor was full up at the time on grad students, and he's like, why don't you go work a harvest, and then we'll see if we can't bring you on in the spring semester. And that is when I first ended up in Oregon. Part of that story is I was looking at places. I was looking very heavily in California, just because of the amount of wineries that are there, the job postings that were there. Oregon a little bit because of Ron Barrett's influence. Washington State, really looking all over. I didn't really look at Europe at that point in time. And then back to this professor, Jack Keegan again. He worked in a wine shop in Columbus, Ohio when he was a grad student at Ohio State with Dave Page. So longtime winemaker from Adelsheim, now has his own brand, Ohio native as well. So he's like, I'll send him a note at Adelsheim, and kind of the rest is history at that point in time. But yeah, so I came out and worked my first vintage in Oregon, 2011, with Dave Page. Gina Hennon was the assistant at the time. Eric Kramer had just moved over to Domaine Serene, and really had an amazing vintage. 2011 was one of the coolest, kind of latest vintages we've had in a long time, and I still kind of loved every minute of it. When I got out here, when I took the job, my brother, he's 10 years older than me, and he had agreed to drive me out and kind of pay for the lodging along the way, and then he was going to fly back, so we were going to take a little road trip, and so he scheduled all his flights and things like that, and then 2011 harvest just kept getting later and later and later, and Gina at one point was finally like, she's like, we're not going to need you for like another month, and so we did the road trip, had a great time coming across the country, saw a few of his old friends along the way, did the Coors Brewery in Denver, and then came out, and he had a good friend up in Seattle. We swung through the Willamette Valley, kind of saw Adelsheim, had a glass of wine at Erath because of the Dick Erath connection, and then visited a friend of his up in Seattle. And once he flew out of Seattle, I spent like a month camping. I went all the way up to the kind of like San Juans, and then all the way down to San Francisco, and I was actually sitting at a Giants game. It was Giants versus the Padres. Grew up a big Reds fan, so but it was cool to sit at the ballpark, and I think it was actually in extra innings, and Gina gave me a call and said that they were ready for me at Adelsheim. So finished the game, went back to my campsite in Napa, and then shot up I-5 and started at Adelsheim. Kind of a wild vintage. My first real like full-on, going from wineries like Harmony Hill and Kincaid Ridge that were 1,000 to 3,000 cases to a winery that's 50,000 cases, was completely wild. We had 10 interns, 4 or 5 full-time staff. Just felt like a totally different world. Felt pretty out of my element at first, but also pretty quickly right into it. We had a really solid intern crew. 2 of the people I worked with, Aaron Kendall was a full-time employee, just full-time, I think, for a short period, and then Tracy Kendall. Yeah, so Aaron and Tracy Kendall were there. I was actually, in the same intern house as Tracy, and so a lot of they were much more on the experience side of interns, and really great like mentors at that level. And then I worked in the lab a lot with Gina and Dave. And so just to be in the room, just to be kind of overhearing some of the conversation, and especially during that vintage where a lot of triage, a lot of decisions that in a really beautiful vintage, maybe you're not making so much. And so, I didn't know what some of it meant for sure, and just overhearing, and they were really great as far as tasting and, really getting everybody involved, and somehow, made a really, rainy, cool, cold vintage a lot of fun, and really a blast. When I left Adelsheim at the end of the vintage, I kind of asked quite a few people's advice, and almost everybody told me to go travel and do some harvest, those kind of things. I was still thinking about maybe going back for grad school, but unfortunately at that point in time, the call of the winery had kind of switched my focus a bit. I was like, oh yeah, finishing the whole deal out. I kind of didn't want to hand the grapes off anymore. So I was once again back in a state where I didn't really know 100% what I wanted to do. And so, Dave and Gina, Tracy, everybody was kind of like, go travel, do New Zealand, do France, go about. And I sort of didn't listen. I think once again, I feel like when I came out and worked at Adelsheim, it started to pull me out of this interview would have been terribly painful for me 10 years ago. It just, I don't think it would have happened. You would have been pulling things out of me. So I was just starting the experience out here, and just really great network of people kind of started to pull me out of that. And so I think I was still a little intimidated about going to New Zealand, going somewhere else. I did apply a few places, and I just wasn't quite ready to do it. So I went back to Ohio in December and checked back in with the family, and I was kind of waiting around, thinking about applying to grad school, thinking about coming back to Oregon, thinking about trying to maybe do France. That still felt like a lot. And I applied to a tasting room job at a winery in Ohio, actually in downtown Cincinnati. I wasn't a big fan of their wine, and it was really just something to kind of hold me over for a little bit. And I got a email response back asking if I'd be interested in the assistant winemaker job that they had, which I don't know if I really was, but I was like, sure, I'll come in. And another kind of curveball that came out of nowhere. This winery is called Myers Wine Cellars, originally founded in Ohio in 1892, and has been in existence ever since. They made it through, actually started as the John C. Meyer Juice Company. They were one of the first in the United States to pasteurize grape juice and actually make it stable for longer on the shelves. That's a big reason they made it through Prohibition. And where all their vineyards were in Cincinnati, it's all now some of the highest in retail, and it's all, there's not really a field in sight. Where the winery is, there's not really a field in sight. Not the most romantic setting, but a super cool history. The original cellar's still there from the 1890s. I kind of told myself, I went in, the winemaker had been there 20 years. He had spent 20 years before that in California. Kind of a similar thing. His family roots were back more in the upstate New York area, but he had kind of come back this way to be a little closer to family. And so, he seemed like he was really great. And so I took it, and I was like, maybe a year. And then by next harvest, West Coast or just something else. And I ended up staying for 4 years, as it is, and really had a really great experience. They are a very big outlier in the Ohio wine industry. Most of the Ohio wine producers, there's about 300 wineries in Ohio, but most of them are, 1,000 to 3,000 cases. There's a few people, mostly along Lake Erie, that might do 10,000 cases, 20,000 cases. Myers Wine Cellars produces about 350,000 cases of wine. Most of it at that time, 10 years ago, a little longer, was about $10.99 was the sweet spot on price. A lot of sweeter wine, a lot of Niagara, Catawba, Concord, table wines, a bit of sparkling wine that was actually fairly interesting, Charmant Method sparkling, some sherries and port style wines, kind of all kinds of different things. Like I said, their history goes back to the 1890s. A consistent producer ever since then. They have a rail spur at the winery, all kinds of weird things that most wineries don't even have. In the 1960s, some of the sherry was actually really popular and was in like the JFK had it in the White House. Weird connections that continue all the way up to today around that winery. We made some sparkling wine for like the Radisson hotels and like just, really bizarre things. But all of a sudden I was like the assistant for this really big production place and really different wines. And it was kind of a wild learning experience. Just kind of thrown right into it and made a lot of wine over those 4 years and really learned a lot about the logistical side of winemaking and just carrying a wine from point A to point B. Didn't learn as much about the finesse, the high touch, the high quality kind of into things. But yeah, we worked with fruit all over. Most of our fruit came from along the Great Lakes. So we worked with Ohio, Michigan, Pennsylvania, New York mostly, kind of wrapping around the Great Lakes. Would all come down to us, and then we'd make the wines from there. Just totally different side of the business, and maintained a lot of connections with the smaller producers in Ohio, with the distributors and things, and like it was kind of always one of those where I always felt like I had one foot out the door, never really, wanted to make the commitment to like even look at like buying a house or like signing another lease or something like that was always, it just never felt like something I wanted to do. So I always thought I would be heading back towards Oregon. I'd really, really fallen in love with Oregon, and so those 4 years, that was kind of each year I'd hit another harvest, and I'd really try. Applied for a few jobs along the way, and it ended up one of the absolute biggest silver lining is that I met my wife in Ohio, and so had I not gone back, that certainly wouldn't have happened. We're just about knocking up on our 8-year anniversary this August. A lot of those experiences there going back to Ohio were kind of wild, and things that I would have, at the time, I really felt like I was wasting my time, just not doing anything productive, not making the kind of wines I wanted to make. And I don't know how many times in the 8 years that I've been back in Oregon, I have drawn on those experiences from those 4 years at Meyer. The winemaker there was Bob Dissler. I should circle back to him. He's retired since, and I think headed back up towards the Great Lakes. But yeah, really great guy. A lot of logistical knowledge. Like I said, he over 20 years at Myers Wine Cellars, so a tremendous amount of wine he moved. I know he was at Weibel and I think a few other places out in California before that. But a great guy and a lot of great experience there. When I finally did make the jump, my wife and I were planning on getting married and trying to figure it out, the move out west. And I still really wanted to finally take Dave and Gina and Tracy's advice and go work a harvest abroad. So that point, I applied around, and I actually still had a little notebook that Tracy had wrote down a few of her recommended wineries in New Zealand. And I applied to everyone on that list, and a few of them accepted me, and I ended up working at Craggy Range in 2016. Kind of went down there, not really knowing what to expect. Still felt like, even though I'd been making a lot of wine, didn't really feel like I was, at that level of, high quality wine. And, we did everything at Meyer was pretty much tank aged, not a lot of barrel work. We did do the sherry in barrel. I'll back up to that for a minute. And it was kind of old bourbon barrels that we would age in a Solera for like 10 years or so. The sherry was pretty cool. If you ever find Meyer's 44 sherry, pretty cool stuff. So I landed at Craggy Range 2016. Craggy was another like really great experience. Matt Stafford was the winemaker there at the time. He has since moved on. Matt was really great. I remember him picking me up from the airport the first day, and just kind of some of our first conversations. Still a little on the shyer side then. I wish I could go back and ask him more questions, which I'm sure he would still talk to me now. And part of, learned a lot of things there that I still carry today. One of them is, if I have the opportunity, I always pick up our interns from the airport. Our first intern for the 24 vintage, Jan Seru, is coming to us from the south of France. And I picked him up last Thursday, and we had a little dinner on the way back. And some of those small things that you pick up along the way. That vintage was, really great. Craggy reminds me a lot of Stoller in some ways. They kind of have a larger production side and a smaller production side, and it's all kind of done under one house. So not that dissimilar to the two wineries here on Stoller's hillside. And got a little involvement with kind of both sides. Their crew was, very transparent, and kind of, just a lot of like, small things about still how to get things done on the larger scale, but to add a little more finesse into it, add a little more attention to detail, making those higher tier bottles of wine, but also making a lot of wine that's your more entry level and the things that support the higher tier brands. A few of the other interns that I worked with that year are still good friends today. Two of the others are here in the Oregon wine industry. One is Jess Spira. She's the assistant winemaker for Chehalem, so part of the Stoller Wine Group. Really good friend of mine. We actually live 2 doors down from each other now. Her and her husband and their young daughter are good friends of our family. The other one is Julia Cresto. She's the assistant winemaker for Ponzi. So all three of us, we call ourselves Craggy Rangers. The Rangers came back to Oregon in 2016 and then stayed, and I kept charging forward. DJ Cook, who you interviewed earlier, also Craggy Ranger a few years after us. And we have one of our interns this year is also coming from Craggy Range, so pretty excited to continue that legacy. Another good friend, Sean DiMartino, is, I believe, director of the viticulture operations down at Grace Family Estate in Napa. So, and then a few others that are all, still very active in the wine industry. Some down in New Zealand, some here. So really great intern class, kind of. And it was pretty exciting to know that a couple of us were all looking to come back to Oregon for our next vintage. I think, that vintage is also responsible for kind of bringing me out of my shell a bit more. And I think Julia and Jess would probably say that I didn't talk much in the beginning, and now I just never shut up. But they probably wish it was a little healthier balance these days. Yeah, so we all were interviewing for spots in the Willamette Valley, getting up for the good old like 5 a.m. interviews with the time change before harvest, and interviewed and was accepted at quite a few places, and was looking for one that maybe had just a touch more responsibility. And at the time, Anna Mee was kind of looking for like a harvest enologist, somebody that was going to have just a a touch more responsibility. Tom Hausman was the winemaker at the time. Andy Gribsko was the assistant, and yeah, so came back to Oregon in 16 for a very different vintage than the 2011 vintage. Very warm, very hot. My wife and I got married over the summer, and then basically our honeymoon was a road trip across the country with our 2 dogs. It was very warm. It was in really early August at that point in time, and yeah, we saw a few sites across the country. Each one of us had a car completely full of our belongings and a dog in the passenger seat on each one. So yeah, pretty comical road trip honeymoon. Yeah, I should probably disagree. And yeah, landed out here. We were actually kind of didn't really have a place lined up to live, so we camped for kind of a few weeks with the dogs, a few hotels, and then we found a nice spot, actually really close to Sokolblosser Winery, up Blanchard Lane there, behind the Rock Shop. There's a few houses up there. So we found a place that was like nestled in vines and like felt like we were kind of in it. My wife doesn't work in the wine industry, so I don't know if she was quite as stoked about just vines everywhere, but she's come around to it. And yeah, that vintage, really beautiful vintage, warm, dry, small harvest, breezy. We actually lost an intern at Anna Mee, just kind of, I think visa or something like that, couldn't make it. But the rest of the crew was, super solid. Once again, a lot of other good influences on my life out of like that intern class, and also Andy and Thomas. One of the interns was a girl named Hannah Miller. Hannah runs the wine club over at Lang, and I think more nowadays. And really great, and one of the biggest impacts on my wife and I's life in Oregon, and potentially this move that I'm going to talk about responsible for us actually staying in Oregon. She invited us to Thanksgiving in 2016. Warm vintage harvest was pretty much over, and she invited us over to her family's house for Thanksgiving, and I think we both felt a little weird, first time ever not doing it with our respective families, and we went, and we've done every Thanksgiving, New Year, Christmas. If we're not back in Ohio, we're with this family, the Millers. Lee and Kathy Miller are the mom and dad. That they have a vineyard just a little bit north of here, still in the Dundee Hills. And Hannah's their youngest daughter. Their older daughter, Annika, has her own brand, Burton Bittman. And really strong connection to the wine industry. They've been growing grapes in the Dundee Hills since the very early 90s. Originally split their piece of property with Dave Lett in the late 80s. And yeah, they've been kind of going ever since. Tukwila Vineyards is the name of it. They added on another piece right after we met them. And they said they've been kind of our surrogate family out here on the West Coast, and really wonderful folks, and a big part of, like I said, just making us feel at home, and yeah, really responsible for probably us not getting cold feet and pulling out at the times. I stayed on at Anna Mee after the 2016 vintage as kind of a long-term intern. So I was there through kind of the late spring, was looking for jobs. And Thomas came to me one day and he's like, would you ever consider leaving the Willamette Valley? Which I probably didn't make too friendly of a face at the time, because I really hadn't, not so quickly anyway. And he's like, I have a good friend who has a project down in the Umpqua Valley. So I think that eased me a little bit, just being a little bit south of the Willamette. Not thought maybe he was coming with a California or somewhere further away. And yeah, introduced me to a project called Paul O'Brien in the Umpqua Valley. Paul O'Brien is not actually a person, a combination of two names, Scott O'Brien Kelly and Dyson Paul DeMera. Dyson DeMera owns Hillcrest Winery, which has a very long history in Oregon. And Scott Kelly runs so they co-own Paul O'Brien Winery. Scott Kelly's the winemaker for it. And Thomas and Scott Kelly have become friends through some of the steamboat dinners and the kind of wine camps that were held there over the years. And I think at that time, Scott was the winemaker he worked for the Constellation for a number of years, but down in the Central Coast. So still had a lot of interaction with Pinot Noir. And he had just fairly recently in 2013 come up and established Paul O'Brien, started making wine in the Umpqua Valley. And so I went down and interviewed with him for an enologist position. He was the sole employee at the time, and so it's one of those good old enologist slash janitor slash salesman slash many hats, and a lot of those in the wine industry. And yeah, I ended up, my wife and I visited a couple times. We had dinner with Scott and his family, and kind of checked out the Roseburg and the greater Umpqua Valley in general, and decided that it seemed like a good move, a solid move. So in the spring of 2017, we moved down to the Umpqua Valley, down to Roseburg, and I started as the enologist at Paul O'Brien. That first year, the year before, Paul O'Brien had done about 350 tons. That next year we did 800 tons. So it was a very quick kind of ramping up. Made wine for a few different projects beyond Paul O'Brien, and yeah, kind of learned a lot very quickly there on a very different level. Anime had been about 250 tons, kind of a average size Willamette Valley winery, and Paul O'Brien, it was on the rise. I'd never really been around a winery that wasn't kind of locked in on its production. And so that was a brand new experience. Kind of bringing on interns, a harder area to kind of draw interns to. And but some of my experience in Ohio, that was one of the first things coming back to hiring seasonal folks in Cincinnati that had no interest in wine. And in the Umpqua Valley, sometimes it would be there'd be people moving there for like the forestry industry, and their partner needed a job, and I was like, you're perfect. Somebody was moving to be like a zoologist at the wildlife park that's there, and their partner needed a job. I was like, yep, you're. They drove a forklift at Martinelli, Apple at one point in time. It was like perfect, and I kind of love it when some of those different backgrounds come around. Usually interns. You get a lot of amazing interns that have a lot of harvest behind them, and they're great. And then there's usually one that has like no experience or really weird experience that turns out to be one of the most fun and surprising ones. And I think the Umpqua each year they're drawing a little better, a little more recognition, and able to pull some more people into the valley, some more talent, which is great. So yeah, I spent 3 years there at Paul O'Brien. And we kind of grew the brand. We didn't grow as rapidly from the 350 to the 8. We kind of stuck in that realm, did about 1,000 tons the following vintage. And hired a few full-time employees, kind of sort of newer to that experience. Hired a few people in Ohio. But yeah, I kind of trained them from the ground up. We one of the unique things at Paul O'Brien is we worked with all outsourced fruit. We didn't own any vineyards, And we worked with almost equal amounts of fruit from the Willamette Valley, the Umpqua Valley, and the Rogue Valley. So got to get my hands on a lot of different fruit, a lot of different regions. So we still did quite a bit of Pinot Noir. And then beyond that, in the red department, we did a fair amount of Tempranillo, and then a lot of smaller lot, Syrah, Cabernet, Merlot. Actually, really cool Merlot out of the Umpqua Valley. I think it's one of the underrated wines down there, and underrated wines probably around the world, but whole nother conversation. Yeah, just all kinds of things, and even just exploring some of the vineyards around that, have everything from Vermentino to, Grenache Blanc to Tannat and Pinotage and all kinds of different things. Didn't necessarily work with all those varieties, but yeah, got to do a lot in a very short amount of time, a lot of different varieties, and really kind of helped build out part of the winery there. And a lot of great experience working with Scott and Dyson. Scott, I just clicked back in my mind, Estancia Winery was the one on the Central Coast that he kind of had most recently been the director of winemaking for before he came up and founded Paul O'Brien. But a lot of experience in the kind of Mondavi Constellation world of different wineries, and a lot of years of experience between him and Dyson coming to the table. That whole time, my wife and I, we really loved the outdoors in the Umpqua Valley, and but there was something that just kind of kept pulling us back up north a bit the whole time. Part of it might have been our good friends the Millers coming back up for Thanksgiving and Easter and things like that, and then also like Julia Cresto and Jess Spira. They spent different amounts of time at like Pinnerash and Domaine Serene before their current roles, and so I think just a little bit more of kind of our core group of people were still up here in the valley, and so kind of always kept pulling me back this way. And so in 2019, started looking to come back up north. And yeah, that's when started getting introduced to Stoller, and it was one of the first. The whole time I was kind of telling myself I was kind of at the point where I wanted to make the right move. I didn't just want to come back up north just to get up here, and I think. At that point, we were just starting to feel, my wife and I were just starting to feel like so 3 years around in Oregon, it was like starting to get over those homesick blues and starting to be a little easier. And so I was like, don't want to make the wrong move, come up and, hate life for a while just to get up north. And so yeah, I was really selective. And when Stoller came along, I knew that was a really good opportunity. Jason Tosh, Stoller's current vice president of viticulture, he was at Anime when I was there. He was the vineyard manager, and he actually left to move over to Stoller right before I did. I remember the last lunch we had at Anime, he had a very big grin on his face the whole time, and so I was like, it must be good over there. I was like, I think it's going to be nice. So yeah, I came up for the first interview and met with Kate Payne Brown, Ben Howe, and Melissa Burr all at once, and kind of ran through the fairly standard interview process, going through the history. One of the things I've sort of had to do throughout my career, especially that time in Ohio, they'd always be like, so what's going on in Ohio? Or do you actually know anything kind of deal was a real common question. And, it was like here or there. At that point in time, almost like a little bit of similar questions around kind of the Umpqua Valley, and just even just a few years ago, each year it seems to be a little more known, and as a few producers get their names out and about, and producers from the Rogue Valley and Columbia Gorge. And I think each year we just see more and more really great wines coming out of these other regions within Oregon. Yeah, so kind of ran through some of that, and I got, some really great vibes. We didn't tour the expanse of Stoller, quite an operation, but we walked through the Reserve Winery here. This was for I guess I didn't mention, for assistant winemaker position at the Reserve Winery. So Kate Payne Brown was the winemaker at the time. Melissa is still very involved, and then Ben was the winemaker for the estate winery, but also kind of the overarching director of winemaking on this hillside. So all very involved. Toured through, really beautiful, amazing facility. Got very, very excited, probably too excited, and actually did interview at one other winery here in the valley, also very good winery, and pretty good feels about that as well. And headed back down south and the waiting game for a little bit there, and got kind of called back for second interviews at both, and didn't really know at the time, which way I was going to lean, or even, of course, if you're going to get offered either. And came back to Stoller. We have a kind of very fancy, very kind of swanky library at the bottom of the Reserves winery that is kind of dim and also very chilly because it's holding a lot of library wines. And it's a long wooden table, so chilly. It's like Melissa, Ben, and Kate, and myself, very spread out. This was 2019. It was kind of right at the tail end of Game of Thrones. It felt very, the table's even like it's a natural piece of wood, so very, and it was very chilly, so we all had blankets over us, and it literally felt like it should have been like an animal skin, and I was like, this is going to be really intense, and we actually had a pretty much short interview, and they offered me the job at the end of it, so it was not near as intense as it was feeling out of the gate. I remember one of the questions during my first interview that Kate asked me specifically, and Kate wanted to know what I really wanted to get out of the position going forward. And one of the things that immediately kind of came to mind was still I feel like each step along the road, kind of the attention to detail level and it's just those fine touches on wines has kind of just keeps building. And I think that's very, it's very common throughout your career. You pick things up from everywhere, even if it's something you pick up not to do. And those things are super important. And so I talked to Kate about that I really just wanted to, as far as blending goes, take it down to the very nitpicky, small level of finesse, and figure out how you're, crafting these wines that are, that can live a long time, that have really unique identities. And we had kind of run through a bit of the portfolio of the wines here at the Reserve Winery, and one of the coolest things about Stoller's Reserve program is every bit of fruit that we work with is right off this hillside here. One of the challenges around that is every bit of the fruit is off this hillside right here. So not only logistically does it make your harvest window pretty short, but also creating 7 or 8 different Pinot Noirs that have their own unique kind of identities. And so I don't know how much we really talked about that day during the interview, but it was one of the things that almost immediately coming to Stoller was really being fulfilled from a very early spot. So yeah, I got the job, champagne, all that good things, and my wife and I moved back up here in July. Actually, July 8th was my first day, so yesterday was my 5-year anniversary at Stoller.
Congratulations.
Thank you. It's been a blur. It's been, it feels like one of those where it feels like 10 years and like 2 at the same time. And we actually, so we moved back up. My poor parents, who have always been wonderful and supportive, they had a visit scheduled to come see us in the Umpqua Valley. And I had to call them and basically be like, so when you're in town, we're going to pack everything up and drive up to the up north. And so they were fairly willing participants. They're both retired now, and so I kind of promise them going forward, no more work during your vacations. But so we moved up here and kind of jumped into things at the Reserve Winery. So Kate Payne Brown was the winemaker. I was the assistant. A gentleman named Chase Abbott was our cellar master at the time. Really great crew, small crew. We were doing around 20,000 cases of wine at the time. And trying to get back in the swing of, while we are the kind of smaller winery on the Stoller property, we're pretty average size for the Willamette Valley again, at that, 20,000 case mark. Facilities really amazing, gravity flow, which was a whole new kind of game for me. So still continuing that learning curve. We started picking sparkling in late August of 19, so pretty quick orientation period there and kind of right into it. 19 was a fun vintage, a little bit of rain, and it's kind of one of the first times we had a little challenge during harvest in quite a number of years. Brought me back a little bit to 2011, but nothing quite like that. Just jumping in and figuring out the dynamics at Stoller. A lot of collaboration between the Reserve Winery, the Estate Winery here, and then Chehalem Winery. In the interim, that's when Jess Spira, 6 months or so before me, had taken the assistant role over at Chehalem. So kind of the interconnections of the wine world just kept moving, and really, really great vintage. And then the next 4 vintages, Kate and I worked really closely together, and that's where, like I said, we would always, being a small team, kind of get everybody in on blending as much as we can. And like I said, making 7 or 8 different cuvées of Pinot Noir off the same hillside. We have really amazing source material here, some 30-year-old vines, and a lot of opportunity. Stoller in general really sets all their folks up to succeed. We're working with good material, good equipment, good people. It's one of those where if you find the right fit, I think it's amazing. And Kate and I worked really great together, and still really good friends. She lives right around the corner from me nowadays, really my time here at Stoller. And one of the amazing things too is because of the nature of the Stoller Wine Group, we have three dedicated winemakers to the individual winemaking facilities, a director, and then Melissa is still around in the founding winemaker role. So, 5 winemakers, 3 assistants, just a tremendous amount of winemaking knowledge on this hillside that we can all draw from. And between everybody's stories like this, just pulling from all different sections, I think that's been one of the most powerful things. And then being back up in the northern Willamette, the connection to just the wine industry in general, very collaborative, and to get back up to people that I know, and then people that I now know, introduced to people, and everybody's just so willing to share and spread things that I feel like the ability to grow and to continue your education and your just personal growth is huge in the northern Willamette Valley, and in the wine industry in general. We've really, like, my wife and I got settled in. We spent the first 3 years in Newburgh, and then we were able to buy a house 2 years ago in McMinnville. Moved down there, and it's like I said, Jess Spear from Chalem's a couple doors down. Kate's still around the corner. Actually, DJ lives a few blocks down from me. We've got Soder, we've got Sokoblasser. It's a nice little winemaking neighborhood. And then also a lot of very nice folks that do not have anything to do with wine, which is nice to be around. My wife enjoys to have some people that don't wine out too hard. But yeah, I feel like we've really found, our home, our community, and then the winemaking world. The next kind of major change came in 2023. The spring of 23, Kate Payne Brown threw us all a curveball and let us know that she'd be moving on to a new adventure on the north side of the Dundee Hills. And yeah, it was one of those that really kind of took me by surprise. I didn't think Kate was going anywhere for a bit, and wasn't really planning to go anywhere myself either. I was really happy in my role, and a bit of nerves there for a bit, trying to figure out what was going to happen next. And Melissa and Ben and Bill Stoller and Gary Mortensen, our president, I think everybody kind of came together, and also just on Kate's recommendation, offered me the kind of shot at taking over the head winemaking role at the Reserve Winery. And I worked really closely with Ben. So through that transitional period, Ben Howe was promoted to our VP of winemaking, and so he oversees myself, Katie Santora at Chehalem, and then Carl Weichelt has been the winemaker at the estate for a few years. And so, him and I worked really closely through this last vintage, and it was certainly nerve-wracking from the time Kate officially left in June. So it's just been a little over a year now. Through the last wines going down to barrel in 2023, I think it was a constant roller coaster of, I have no idea what I'm doing, and I completely have this, got it under control, and then each day, we make a fair amount of sparkling wine at the Reserve Winery, and which was a fairly new venture for me in the traditional method. Like I said, at Myers in Ohio, I had made a fair amount of Charmat method sparkling wine. So the first grapes we always pick off of this hillside are sparkling wine, usually Pinot Meunier. And when I was going out to make that pick call to pick the grapes, we're one of the warmer sites in the Willamette Valley. We're usually one of the first to go, so nobody else had really picked any grapes in the valley. And I worked closely with Ben, and obviously we're looking at numbers and tasting and just looking at the fruit. And I was like, yeah, let's do it. And I think I went back that night and laying in bed and texting Kate, and I was like, picking the Pinot Meunier tomorrow. I'm totally wrong decision. It can't be ready. It's not there, or I've totally already missed it. And she's like, it's gonna be great. She's like, yeah, you'll think that for every single decision you ever make for the rest of your. And I was like, all right, perfect. And she wasn't necessarily wrong, but yeah, we did that first pick, and there's actually a picture that Stoller has. They took that day and immortalized on Instagram, and I do not look like I have a really great face on. It was the day, they're bringing the fruit in, and I'm basically standing there no, it wasn't ready. Go. But the numbers actually came out great. And from there, like I said, one of the challenges of this hillside is it pretty much all wants to start going from there. And so decisions had to come. I really got to bite my nails a lot and chew that decision over a lot, too much. And from then on, it kind of starts falling. The dominoes start falling a lot faster, and just started getting a little more comfortable. And you don't hit every single one of them right on the head, but you do the best you can. You move forward, and with Ben and our lab here, our lab team, and the other winemakers, just a lot of tremendous resources around me. And my cellar master, Alex Arena, he's been with us since 2020 with Stoller, and 21 with the Reserve Winery. He stepped up, and we just kind of all banded together and got through it on the resources that we've had from all these years. And like I said, I don't think until it was all down to barrel. Did I really feel like, I had it under control? Never felt like it got too far off the reins. And kind of talking to some interns at the end of harvest, they were all like, no, like it always felt like it was on the rails. I was like, all right, it makes you feel a little better. I think internally it was certainly off the rails quite a bit. But yeah. And then, kind of officially promoted to the reserve winemaker at the tail end of harvest there, and trial by fire, and pulled through. And it's been a great experience since then. Each day I feel a little more comfortable in the role, and stepping into some of the non-harvest responsibilities. Harvest feels a little bit like a reflex, and then some of the others. And we're just kind of wrapping up our blending season. So still collaboratively as an effort. So one of the things that, I wanted to learn most about, now I'm, leading, and 5 years later, which is very exciting. And I still, some of the first wines we kind of put to bottle from the 23 vintage still had me pretty nervous then, but feeling better now. And we're actively blending our 23 Pinot Noirs now, and both still at the bench level and also at the barrel level, and the full wine blends. And it's pretty fun. Melissa and I tasted through some things yesterday, and Ben and I are actually going to taste through some things after this interview. So like I said, once again, Stoller's resources of winemaking talent and different palates, different perspectives. It's just tremendous, and being able to pull this whole team together, and it's been an amazing opportunity. It's been a whirlwind.
It's a lot of my questions all taken care of. Well, let's talk real quick about takeaways. So first harvest in charge last year, you mentioned kind of a reflex and kind of a lot of doubt, a lot of hesitation perhaps. Tell me about biggest takeaways coming into harvest 2024. What are you looking forward to this year, and what is going to be different about this year?
Some of the largest amount of time that I've spent, a lot of time at home, just sitting thinking, but about how I would do things differently. And one of the best things is, like I said, Kate and I worked really well together. And I always felt like Kate, she's always very thoughtful about her decision making, and some of the way that she can pull blends together and things like that still amazes me. And when I came onto the team, I thought I brought a little bit more from some of my experiences at Meyer and Paul O'Brien, a little bit more of a logistical approach, and so we balanced each other really well. And so a big thing going into 23, and then even more so going into 24, is I kind of have to keep the reins on that, not making things too logistical. Part of being at the reserve facility is that we do make a smaller amount of wine. We make it in different approaches and a lot of high touch, but we have that availability to take the time with it and go. And so just always keeping that in the back of my mind and in our entire team's mind. Alex Arena is still the cellar master, and then we brought on a gentleman named Nico Moreau, who was relatively new to the wine industry, originally from France, but he came on as our third full-time team member. So keeping it in all of our heads that we have time, and so we'll step back and make sure we're making the right decisions. And you obviously can't think too long when it's harvest time, but going from there. And then we're really working, one of the things I'm most excited about is DJ, our viticulturist, and myself, and Jason Tosh, the VP of viticulture, and Chris Lake, our vineyard manager. We're all kind of working closely to try to find some of the real sweet spots of the vineyard. So we already make some high-tier cuvées. Our legacy tier wines are tailored to 3 very specific blocks of the vineyard. There's some of the oldest vines on the property, some of the vine sections that have shown the most true identity, expression. They're different than the rest year in and year out. And now that those sections are all around 30 years old, we're trying to find even the kind of sweeter spots within them. So it might be 2 to 3 acres worth, and we want to find the best ton of fruit. So the best individual spot, and that's going to be one of those that might take a few years to really try to find that. And we might find that one section doesn't really have that it's better as a whole section. And so that one's something that's really exciting going into 2024. I also think just being a little more confident in general of my experience, and even when something, every once in a while you'll pick a section and it doesn't really come out, the numbers don't come out the way that your sample came out, things like that, and it's not necessarily anybody's fault. It's agriculture. It's you're randomly sampling grapes and things like that, and knowing that over the arc of all these beautiful sections of fruit we have here, that we can still find a really balanced blend. And sometimes the section that you feel like, oh man, that one was a little underripe or a little overripe, or sometimes when the whole blend ends up coming together, that's something really kind of beautiful. So letting a little bit of that, you're not going to nail them all. And if you did nail them all, it might actually not be that interesting. Yeah, I think just being a little more comfortable, and all of us on the team being a little more comfortable and going forward with it. We have a few different things that we're trying to do to elevate. We're, like I said, kind of working really hand in hand with the vineyard to find those kind of sweet spots, shifting a little bit of barrel cooperage around, things like that. One of the other really beautiful things at Stoller is they give us a lot of license at the reserve facility to experiment and play around with things. And so we, constantly doing different fermentation techniques and things like that. And a lot of that was things that were ongoing under Kate. And so keeping some things going, introducing some new things. And I think one of the biggest things I'm looking forward to in 2024 is just kind of letting a lot of that stress go and just hopefully, fingers crossed, just enjoy it a little bit more. Not that I didn't enjoy it last year, but I think a few gray hairs might have creeped in. And so hopefully this year they'll color back up. But we'll see. We never know what the vintage is going to give us. I feel like every year in Oregon now, somebody says something along the lines of, it's never done this in Oregon before. And so actually getting a little more used to that and a little more comfortable with whether it's a spring freeze, hopefully not smoke, things like that. Latest bloom on record, earliest bloom on record, shortest window from bloom to, from bud break to bloom, all kinds of things. It's the vineyard and the seasons continue to surprise us every single year. I don't know how many times I've heard it's either going to be a light harvest or a heavy or a late or this, and then it just totally surprises us. Or even if it is a late harvest, it stays beautiful to the end of October. And so, really fortunate, and I think it's going to be great.
You have kind of a unique story for the people we talk to, and that you knew you wanted to do wine from a pretty early age compared to most. So tell me now, looking back, what is it about wine or winemaking that has kept you engaged, kept you excited? What is it that appeals it to you?
Yeah, absolutely. What I generally tell people is that I can't do anything else now, so I'm trapped, doomed. So I still am a huge wine geek at heart. It's a lot of my time outside of work is kind of reading, and I still really love going tasting places and things like that. So it's really big in my life outside of work. My wife and I really love camping, outdoor things. That's what we spend a lot of our time doing. And so the Pacific Northwest is, obviously a playground. Whenever I'm trying to hire interns, I'm always like, we're an hour from the coast, an hour from the mountains, an hour from Portland. What do you want? As long as you don't want to be less than an hour from all those things. No. And it's even just what's right out our back doors is really amazing. So I think just the land, the Pacific Northwest in general, has really encouraged that. Beyond that, the wine community is the biggest one for me. A lot of our really good friends are, in the industry as well. And even as people change, people's winemaking careers take all kinds of different directions. And some people start on the sales side and come into the cellar. Some people can start in the cellar and go to the sales or marketing. And as the the industry continues to expand, the opportunities, the hospitality opportunities, the culinary opportunities, just every year it's more and more. And you see more wineries hiring people in all these different departments that didn't used to exist. So it's pretty amazing. And as those worlds just open more and more, the people that you meet are, it's not just a bunch of cellar rats anymore. There's a lot of folks from really diverse backgrounds, and so great community. And the people that they know that aren't in the wine community, you usually end up getting to know those, and really broad backgrounds as well. And so each year is kind of a new experience and new things. So I think the community in general is what's kept me in it and kept me interested, and also the ability to evolve over time. Like I said, this I think for a lot of years, obviously the kind of head winemaker spot was the goal, and I had got to a point there with Kate where that sort of didn't matter anymore. We had a really good spot, and kind of figured that would evolve into kind of maybe an associate thing, and the title got to the point where I was making wine, and so that didn't matter as much anymore. And now that I have it, as one of the biggest things is a lot of people have asked me what's next, and I tell them nothing for 10 years, hopefully. And but it's fun to see what you let me get comfortable. But all the opportunities that are out there, and that still keep you close to wine, kind of comes back to the Jack Keegan, Miami University, all these folks that I meet that are still connected in the industry, even if they're just marginally. It's pretty amazing what the wine world can offer you. Even if you never touch a grape.
Well, then, since I can't ask you what's next, let me ask it this way. What have you not done yet that you want to do? What is a goal you haven't achieved yet?
I think one of the major goals that I haven't achieved yet is I always wanted to do a European harvest, probably France. And so kind of working to get at least part of that. So we have some pretty strong connections in France. The Chalem team actually just got back from France. Working a full-on harvest is probably not terribly likely. France is usually a little bit ahead of us, and some of their harvests are a little smaller, especially depending on the size of the domain. Some of them, 1 week is all the grapes are in. A week later, the fermentations are pretty much done. And so it can be fairly condensed. But maybe, especially as Stoller is expanding, each year, they started making sparkling wine in 2013. And then in 2019, my first vintage year is when we brought it all in-house. We used to use Radiant sparkling wine before then with Andrew Davis. We got kind of our own equipment and felt comfortable enough to move it in. And so the sparkling wine's kind of all in-house and something that we've been steadily kind of growing over the years. So maybe trying to sneak in a little bit of time in Champagne, leading kind of right up to harvest, maybe even a little bit of harvest, peek in on some of their pressing and whatnot. And if not, throughout the year, once again, a lot of it to me comes back to blending. And so to sit in with some wineries kind of during their late spring, blending sessions could really be pretty amazing. So don't know if I honestly want to work a full-on harvest somewhere else, So maybe sitting in at a different time in the year, kind of one of those crucial times when a lot of the decision-making around cuvées and whatnot is happening. I think that would be a really rewarding experience. I think we're trying to maybe get the whole team over next year for a bit of a visit, and then maybe potentially working some of it into a little bit more of a, maybe not an every year thing, but trying to kind of build a few relationships with some producers that we could be fun to be able to see something a couple years in a row and see how it follows through, and yeah, just keep broadening the experience, bring in new things, and yeah.
Right. That's all the questions that I have for you. Anything I didn't ask that I should have, or anything we didn't cover that you need to cover?
I don't really think so. Just rambling along.
You covered it very, very well. So thank you so much.
Yeah, absolutely.
Sharing your story with us, taking the time to be part of our work here. I'll go ahead and let you off the hook.